the tides of the Kirawira.
Just over 30 years ago, this place came to the attention of the world. Ever since then, the name Serengeti has conjured up images of the last great herds. There are over 1.5 million wildebeest here. Together they form the black tide that ebbs and flows across the Serengeti. The movements of the great herds, like those of many other creatures, will shadow the rains. While it is raining on the plains, 80 miles away to the west, it is very different. This place is Kirawira, a 10-mile stretch of leafy riverbed. Hidden away from mainstream Serengeti, yet tied to it by the wildebeest which come here every year. And by this. Born in the thunderstorms on the plains, this flash flood is the grumeti. The swelling black tide of the wildebeest gathering away on the plains and the brown flood of the grumeti are the twin tides that come here every year. The tides of Kirawira. In a few months, the river will ebb away, counting down to the time when the wildebeest will inundate Kirawira and its guardians. This is the story of those few months, of the opportunities and the ordeals for the riverside animals as Kirawira dries to become a corridor of sand. But now it is the end of the wet season, and the last of the rain is draining westwards. The river runs 100 miles or so in and out of the national park on its way to Lake Victoria. Rarely more than a few yards wide, at first glance it is like 100 other small rivers that flow into the lake. But this river flows through Serengeti, and the 10-mile stretch called Kirawira is home to the continent's most spectacular crocodiles. Unable to challenge the full force of the spate, these little fish have had to wait until now, as the flood begins to falter. They are loaches, struggling upstream to their spawning grounds. The loach has an underhung mouth with suction disc grip. By alternately clamping fast, then swimming hard, the little fish inch their way up against the rapids. They travel as a shoal and go up in a rush, trying to get through this dangerous passage before all the activity attracts attention. The concentrated fish are a windfall for the green-backed heron. Although she takes them as fast as she can, most will get past her. By the time the monitor lizard and the hammerkop arrive, the larger part of the shoal is already through. Swamping the predators for a few minutes at a time means far fewer losses for the loaches as they struggle upstream on their yearly migration to spawn. For the freshwater clams living in the riverbed, spawning is more of a problem. They cannot swim upstream like the fish. In the ocean where they originated, their larvae are dispersed by the tides. But this tide is a one-way ticket, all the way downstream to Lake Victoria. The problem is solved in a remarkable way, for without knowing it, many of the passing catfish are picking up passengers. The microscopic clam larvae search out the fish and attach to their gills as they pass upstream. Some weeks later, already changed into tiny clams, they will fall off, ready to take up life in the riverbed. These fish have left it too late. They are trapped in a pool by the falling tide. Although not the most sporting of fishermen, the monitor lizard is one of the most versatile. Lacking the sharp beak and reflexes of the heron, the lizard's fishing is more holistic. It sweeps the pool, using its whole body as a seine net to try and trap the last of the landlocked fish. A small fish is a reasonable catch for a monitor lizard. But what about the river's largest predators? Incredibly, even Kirawira's giant crocodiles will stoop to catch tiddlers, if there are enough of them. As the water level falls, small catfish, known as squeakers, are concentrated into pools where their numbers force them to the surface to gulp air. Compared to the seining technique of the monitor, the crocodiles is a more communal approach. Swimming together, the crocs drive the fish up into the shallows and, in an extraordinary display of cooperation, form a living dam. Lying 4 or 5 abreast across the river, they confine the fish in a reptilian corral where they can feed on them at leisure. At this time of year, the large male crocodiles are territorial, and one dominant male would normally have this pool to himself, challenging all comers. But a fight here would break up the dam and release all the fish. It seems that for a few hours, all aggression is suppressed, as up to 70 crocodiles pool together to fish, all squashed into a few yards of water. It is not possible for a few tiny fish to support such a collection of monsters, but as hors d'oeuvre, they will tide the crocs over until the main course arrives. There is no escape for the shoal this time, and all the activity attracts birds to get in on the act. The hammerkop's approach is to hover, then snatch. The pelicans prefer to dip net. And the wood stork to tickle and probe. Whatever the method, the little catfish are easy to catch, but they are not so easy to swallow, for on capture the squeaker locks its spines fast. They are modified fin rays, needle sharp and serrated on both sides, designed to jam in a predator's throat. They operate like a ratchet that only the fish can release. The pelican is like a child with a sore throat who has been given a bag of crisps, determined to eat every last one no matter how excruciating it is. It might be an hour before all the fish relax, but the only alternative is to try and break down the spines. With the dry season tightening its hold on Kirawira, each day the river is a little narrower, the pools a little shallower. It is scarcely noticeable at first, barely half an inch a day. But the rocks carry the record, like plimsoll lines or bands on a glass of draft Guinness. Normally, a crab is active at night, but with its hole high and dry, it must seek refuge in the dwindling pools. It is temporary security, for now that the river has stopped flowing, the marsh mongoose comes tide pooling. Every moment spent close to deep water is an invitation to a crocodile. Even at the margins, the marsh mongoose will not spend any longer than he needs. The receding river exposes more food each day and puts the overhanging trees more out of reach, so it is a good time for the riverside birds to nest. The red-headed weaver builds his nest high above the water, out on the limb of a thorn tree. The saddlebill storks use a thorn tree too, and will build their nest right at the top. Protected by thorns, both the weaver and the storks are well out of harm's way. The green-backed heron chooses to nest here, in a clump of reeds just a few feet above the river and its giant crocodiles. Her mate will not risk flying to the nest. To raise their family, the herons must rely on stealth and camouflage. As they change duties, they have due cause to be cautious. For their eggs are hatching, and visits to the nest will need to be more frequent when they start feeding their chicks. With increased predation and drying pools, it's a tough time of year for the fish. But to look at the killifish in a riverside pool, you might not think so. They're spawning hard. The colorful suitor looks devoted and protective, a shining example of a modern male. But really, he is holding her down. Each time the pair stops, he braces the female so that by curling her lower fin, she can push an egg beneath the sand. Regular couples, threesomes, their spawning has an apocalyptic intensity. It is the climax of their tiny lives, for tomorrow the pool will dry, and with it the killifish and their eggs. Some creatures can move on. The terrapin will find another pool. The killifish will die. But buried in the sediment, their eggs will survive until the next rains come. It is a remarkable lifestyle, enabling a permanent population of fish to live in a pool that is only wet for a few weeks each year. Just occasionally, all the flicking and jumping will get one of the killifish to the safety of a nearby pool. But then, sometimes, it just serves to attract attention. It is perfect timing for the heron. She's catching food for her youngsters now, and a killifish will be a lot easier to regurgitate for her chicks than a spiny squeaker. As the river seeps away at Kirawira and one tide falls, the other is rising. "80 miles away to the southeast, the black tide has turned. The plains are drying out, and the wildebeest are on the move. No individual can halt this tide as it gathers pace and heads out to the west, towards Kirawira and its giant crocodiles. As the wildebeest stream down from the plains, back at Kirawira, there has been a decision. Although the herds migrate from the dry season drought, who would have thought it of clams? Their pools are warming up and drying out, so they have decided to move. Like any decision made without consultation, it starts off with everybody going round in circles. Over the next few hours, the clams mill about, apparently without direction. Some of them will bury down to wait out the dry season in the river bed. The others keep searching for an exit. Eventually, almost all will find the way out. The freshwater oysters are quite literally stuck. They cement themselves to rocks. They cannot move, and unlike the clams, they cannot survive long out of water. A few hours in the sun, and they gape and die. The oysters are only ever seen when the river is this low, and although they smell good, no one quite knows what to do with them. Surrounded by water, they are out of reach of Kirawira's most voracious predator. Safari ants scour the riverbed for prey, but they trek past the clam without even recognizing it as food. It is clammed up so tight that they cannot even smell it. Unlike the oyster, the clam can seal its shell with a waterproof varnish. Although the sand might reach 60 degrees outside, inside its shell the clam is wet and alive. It can survive like this out of water for as long as 2 years, if not spotted by a predator in the meantime. Baboons feed mostly out on the surrounding plains, but food out there is scarce now, and some are forced to glean a living through beachcombing. It is not real tide pooling. The baboon is too fearful of crocodiles to wade around like the mongoose. A vervet monkey would eat clams too, but his jaws are too weak to open them. When times are hard, it is their ability to turn their hands to almost anything that enables baboons and vervets to make full use of what, for them, is such an extraordinary food. Although effective in his application of brute force, the baboon with his mole-grip jaws is crude when compared to the open-bill stork with its combination tool of a beak. The storks come here for a few weeks every year from the shores of Lake Victoria to harvest these pools. The clam was taken with forceps. Now the nutcrackers are brought to bear. They do not break the clam shell, but chip it along the edge so that the spear tip can find purchase. The sharp edge of the fused lower mandible then cuts the muscle like a knife. Then pared and teased, the meat comes out clean. Eating little butt mollusks like this makes the open-bill stork a true specialist. Harsh conditions favor specialization, and now with Kirawira in the grip of the dry season, this specialist flowers. For much of the year, the torrent lily is completely submerged. It can only flower now. Its creamy flower heads are waxy and slippery, and grooved with deep, narrow slots. When a visiting butterfly tries to land, it finds purchase difficult. In trying to hang on, its foot gets guided into the slot, and as it is pulled free, it triggers the flower. There. What the butterfly has unwittingly snared with its clawed foot are two yellow sacs of pollen, joined by a snag line that was set in the slot. It will fly on to the next flower and transfer the pollen sacs in much the same way. It's a neat pollination story for the torrent lily. Not so for the butterfly, for at the next flower it is trapped. The pollen sacs have jammed in the slot, and with them the butterfly's legs. The story is over for the flower. It is now being pollinated. The butterfly can struggle for hours, sometimes days, becoming weaker and weaker. Other insects do get caught. Although not the intended victims, sooner or later their struggling will catch someone's eye. The bush snake is looking for lizards. It's not large enough to pose a serious threat to the flap-necked chameleon, but it's more than enough to set him on edge. It's probably as close to panic as a chameleon ever comes. The bush snake and the chameleon are both opportunists, making frequent visits during the flowering season in the hope of finding a meal amongst the stands of torrent lily. Overlooked by the chameleon, a butterfly occasionally escapes the clutches of the lily, at the cost of a leg or two. Towards the end of the season, some flower heads fill up with amputated limbs. Most of the butterflies will not leave until, dead or dying, they fall like confetti. These are lean times, and although their tiny corpses do not taste good, they will not go to waste. They will help sustain a host of other creatures through the hard times to come. No one can afford to be fussy now. A butterfly being held by its leg in a flower is a delicate prelude for the drama to come. The wildebeest are close. This evening and tonight they will arrive, weary from the long march. In the morning, they will drink. It is what the giant crocodiles at Kirawira have waited for all year. It starts like any other day at Kirawira. But before night falls, the lives of many riverside animals will have changed forever. Drinking and washing are always times to be wary, but today even more so. How the crocodiles know is a mystery. But what they know is that the rumble in the distance will not bring rain. It is the sound of the tide. The wildebeest are here. The great herds have traveled almost 100 miles from the plains where they calved. Although the calves are still suckling, their mother's milk is drying up. The plains are parched and the grazing sparse. All are tired and all are thirsty. The giant crocs are hungry, as the lengths to which they went to catch a few small fish have shown. But they need patience now. Given the choice, the crocs target calves. They are more naive. They wade in deeper. and they have never seen a crocodile before in their lives. Once they have drunk at a pool, the wildebeest will be back. For although they flee from the commotion, they do not recognize the crocodiles as predators. That will take time. Every other predator they know gives chase, and when that happens, they run. Being hunted on the plains was never like this. The crocodile's eye is the only weak point in an otherwise impenetrable head. It is a remarkable escape, deserved by such a spirited response. And the zebra's stripes still line up, so it's not badly hurt. When the croc really gets it right, there is nothing to be done. At the top of its strike, it has already turned with the wildebeest and is well on the way out of deeper water. There are hundreds of such giants at Kirawira. Together they form the most dramatic collection of crocodiles in Africa, sustained by this flood of wildebeest. For the giant crocodiles, the annual visit of the wildebeest is crucial. They rely on this yearly feast and will not feed like this again until the migratory herds return. To keep ahead, each adult need eat only half its body weight in food a year. For this spectacular population of giants, most of that is provided in this short period in the dry season, when the waters are churned as the tides meet at Kirawira. In the aftermath of the flood, all that remains is a few wildebeest hairs. They will provide some small degree of comfort for the wagtail's family when it hatches in a few weeks' time. Throughout the dry season, everything has been concentrating in the few pools that are left. Shallow and warm, they can bloom within hours. It is a froth of floating algae that rises to the surface in the sunlight. All along the river, the greening pools show that it is drying fast. Crocodiles and catfish must move now. The crocs can walk long distances, several miles a day if necessary. But it is hard work for a giant, even harder for a catfish, which will seize up if its skin dries out, so can only manage short walks between pools. Both need to try and find permanent water, the few deep pools that will not dry out. Although catfish can walk and breathe air, for these there is nowhere to go. This is the end of the line. The terrapin must bury himself while the mud is still soft enough. In a few hours' time, it will be too late. This fallen giant will not walk to the water again. He is returning to the river in a different form. The dead crocodile tastes so foul that nothing scavenges it apart from maggots. That you are what you eat is never more true than when you are a maggot. Toads can eat them straight, but the Hadada ibis is more fastidious and washes each one first. A few days later, as a result of all those maggots, the riverbed begins to heave. By pumping up the front of their heads, the first of the red-eyed flies force their way to the surface. Two weeks after it died, the dead giant is sponsoring life further afield, for the first crop of flies is nourishing young wagtails. It is the height of the dry season. At Kirawira, the plains are scorched, the thorn trees bare. For most of its length, the riverbed is waterless. Where there was a pool, the eggs of the killifish lie dried up and dormant, waiting for the rains. The adults' influence is not over yet, for when the pool floods, their husks will ensure a good crop of plankton and kick-start their youngsters on the sprint to maturity. The catfish are barely alive. Although theirs was the deepest pool on this stretch of river, it has gone now. Their skins are almost dry. It can only be a matter of time. In its daily cycle, the human spirit is at its lowest ebb just before dawn. It is the witching hour, a raw and desolate time. For Kirawira, in its seasonal cycle, that time is now. Witness to perhaps 100 such cycles, the next tide here will be this giant's last. The only comfort in that bleak time before dawn is in knowing that dawn will finally come. This time, when there is a rumble in the distance, there is no response from the giant crocodiles. They know that this time, the tide is the Grumeti. These are the twin tides that sweep through Kirawira every year. The black tide of the wildebeest and the brown flood of the Grumeti River. The river is a seasonal lifeline for the creatures at Kirawira. But only together can the twin tides sustain this population of giants. Until that time next year, when away on the plains the clouds start to build and the wildebeest look west, when a distant rumble will announce the return of the tides of Kirawira.
There's a colour brochure accompanying this survival special. If you'd like a copy, please send an A4 stamped addressed envelope clearly stating the programme title to Survival Brochure, Anglia Television, Norwich, NR1 3JG.